Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by University of Northern Iowa political scientist Justin Holmes and political scientist Michael Levy. Hey, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to meet you, Justin.
Nice to meet you, Michael.
Yeah, I cannot believe with all the permutations and combinations of hosts we've had, Michael and Justin have not been on the show together, but of course we are correcting that now. And before we get going with everything we want to talk about, first order of business, I want to thank Justin, Nancy, and W. D'Amico, all new supporters on Patreon, as well as Matthew, who recently came back as a supporter. Also, I want to let folks know that starting sometime in September, we hope to begin experimenting with video episodes. Now, at first, it's going to be a limited rollout test sort of thing for our top supporters. Then we'll make it available for all of our Patreon supporters. And then if that goes well enough, well, we will release it out into the general public and see what happens. But yes, that is something we will be doing. So watch for that, please. All right. So we are recording this a little bit early, so if something weird happens on Friday afternoon, well, it's not our fault. But anyway, so 4 states held primary elections on Tuesday. Now, 2 of the states that held these primaries, Wyoming and California for their 14th congressional district, really, they're so controlled by one party that the primary results are not going to have a huge impact or any impact on partisan balance. So consequently, we're going to be focusing on the other 2 states that held primaries, those being Florida and Alaska. Now, in Florida, Trump-backed Byron Donalds, that's a weird sentence to get out, I don't know, won the Republican nomination for governor, and former Republican David Jolly won the Democratic nomination. They're going to meet in November to determine who replaces term-limited Ron DeSantis. And in the race to determine who's going to finish out the final 2 years of former Senator Marco Rubio's term, Democratic Socialist Angie Nixon upset former National Security Council aide Alexander Vindman and will go up against Republican Ashley Moody. So, Justin, why don't we start with the gubernatorial contest? I mean, what are your thoughts on the primary results and as well as how things look right now for the general election?
Yeah, I think, this is one, the Florida gubernatorial results, I think Donald, really walked away with it. It was kind of a 3-way race, and clearly, he got almost to 50%, and I don't think entirely surprising. I mean, the other 2 candidates were a little quirky, if you will. I actually thought that Fishback was a little interesting in some ways, which is not an endorsement, but interesting in that he was sort of that sort of almost like red-brown alliance kind of candidate. He had some fairly far-left economic views, but was incredibly conservative on social issues. It seemed to have kind of a little bit of a groundswell of young people support, which, I think as we think about kind of the future of the parties, it was interesting. He represented kind of a potential Republican future that really didn't pan out. But I think ultimately, what you get here is more or less the establishment candidate winning. And ultimately, I think probably that's a Republican keep. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Florida was the ultimate swing state, and that's been a long time at this point. And I just don't know, even in a year that I think will be pretty good for Democrats, I just don't know that the national conditions move the needle, that far in that case.
Yeah. So I've got a hot take on the Republican primary for governor in Florida, and that is I think actually it sent a pretty uncomfortable signal for the Republican Party. And hear me out on this, that Byron Donalds goes in with Trump's strong endorsement, and Trump is presumably still extremely influential in Florida Republican politics. Donalds had massive financial support and spent months as the obvious frontrunner. But I think that figure under 50% is a worrying signal for him. Not necessarily that he's going to lose the general election, but what it says about the Republican Party. And I don't want to read in some huge racial message into one vote in one state. it was a crowded primary, a couple of different people. But I was sort of like thinking about the Michigan primary a couple of weeks ago, where Trump strongly endorses Amir Hassan in Michigan's 8th district. Hassan, a Navy veteran, former federal law enforcement official, Black, converted from Islam to Christianity. He raises roughly $700,000. Trump campaigns for him. He loses by 20 points to a guy who raised $1,850. So I kind of like wonder what's going on in the Republican primaries when a very Trump-endorsed candidate in Florida gets less than 50% of the vote, and Jolly, a former Republican, does he potentially have some crossover appeal? I don't know. I still expect, as you said, the Republicans to carry this one, but I'm wondering what's going on with the Republican Party.
Yeah, and Jolly's actually the second consecutive ex-Republican that Florida Democrats have nominated. They nominated Charlie Crist in 2022, and he lost by nearly 20 points to DeSantis that year. And so honestly, there's only been a little bit of polling so far.
Mm-hmm.
What I've seen, Donalds has around a 6-point lead, give or take. But still, it's like you guys, I find it hard to believe the next governor of Florida will be a Democrat. To me, one of the more interesting things may be the gubernatorial race. You can maybe look at it as sort of an influence contest between Trump and DeSantis. I mean, Donalds backed Trump over DeSantis in 2024. And of course, he ended up beating DeSantis' lieutenant governor, Jay Collins, by over 22 points here. I don't know exactly what the future holds for Ron DeSantis, but probably some really nice Fox News sort of gig or something like that. But I don't get the sense that he necessarily has he's going to be the party's next presidential nominee or the party's presidential nominee at all at this point.
I'm a little skeptical, I have to say, of the strategy of running ex-Republicans as Democrats. I think there is a certain appeal on paper and, in a Downsian sort of sense, the median voter stuff. It certainly has a bit of an appeal, but I do wonder, given that you are kind of balancing appealing to independents and appealing to moderates and turning out your base, I do wonder if that goes a little too far in the other direction, in terms of not energizing Democrats. I think you can tell a good story as an ex-Republican, oh gosh, the party left me. And we get that from, ex-Democrats as well. But I feel like the ex-party people just in general that hold on to offices, people like Zell Miller and folks like that tend to be the ones that are incumbents and switch, rather than I'm going to switch and run for something. And I am just a little skeptical here clearly that's what the primary voters pick, but I don't know if that's, again, I don't know that any Democrat is really viable in Florida at this point. But I don't know that strategy is any more viable than running somebody who is a little more traditionally Democratic, not even necessarily progressive, but just like has a track record as a Democrat.
I have a question for both of you, and I'm not convinced by what I'm about to ask, so I don't want to set it up as though I agree with one side. But I'm kind of wondering. I don't think Angie Nixon has much of a shot on the Senate side, and I know we haven't gone into that race yet, but I'm kind of wondering, and I'm skeptical as well of running ex-Republicans, but having an ex-Republican who is, I'm not going to say he's liberal, he's fairly moderate. I'm wondering if that gives Jolly a chance, because I'm thinking Angie Nixon could juice some of the Black turnout, particularly in Jacksonville and the across northern Florida and in the Orlando area and Tampa. And does that potentially make him more competitive by having her enthusiasm among young voters and Black voters to come out and vote for the Democratic ticket, that if you had two ex-Republicans running, that it might depress some Democratic turn? So I'm just trying to wonder, do you guys see Angie Nixon actually potentially giving Jolly coattails in the Democratic in the gubernatorial?
Go ahead.
I think that's a really interesting hypothesis, actually. There is that possibility that, hey, we can bring multiple constituencies along. And we often talk about that in sort of one race and, bundling a coalition. But maybe, I guess I'd never really pondered that idea of bundling a coalition across races, in terms of turnout. I think one thing that I would look at, just kind of spitballing here a little bit, but what the relationship between those two candidates is. So we've had, I think, differing approaches across the primaries in terms of, kind of traditional Democrats and progressives, DSA candidates making nice afterwards, with at least some, kind of losing traditional Democrats withholding endorsements and things like that. So I think it kind of depends how the two of them interact going forward. Can they be part of the same team or not? Because I think, kind of for your hypothesis to work, I think they need to kind of embrace each other, and whether or not that makes, whether or not that's something either one of them is comfortable with, I'm not clear yet.
I'll answer a little more succinctly. No. I don't think Nixon. I don't think Nixon has any coattails. We take a look at turnout for the Florida for the primary, 24.5%. That's compared to 26% in the last midterm primary in 2022. The last midterm general election, 48%. So we have this. We all know how primaries work. You have this much smaller part of the electorate coming out, and I just think that in a state where Democratic registration trails Republican registration by over 11%, even in a very positive environment for Democrats, I just do not see, especially a Democratic Socialist, having any kind of electoral coattails. I mean, she's even saying now, apparently, sort of trying to disavow a little bit, saying, "Oh, I'm not a socialist or anything." But and so, yeah, I don't think there's any kind of coattails. I think Florida is still solidly Republican territory, and they're going to have to show me something very different, Democrats in that state, for me to think otherwise. The other thing I'll say is, it's weird because we tend to think now of Florida as being, I think, so Republican for so long, but as recently as 2020, Democrats actually slightly led Republicans in Florida voters registration, which is just kind of a bizarre thing there. It's amazingly how quickly things have turned in that state.
Yeah, it's funny that you said that, because I was thinking about how Ohio and Florida were these presidential bellwethers 25 years ago, and now it's, with the exception of maybe Sherrod Brown and the data center issue, which we might talk about later, having a chance in Iowa, maybe a pretty good chance in Ohio to win. But yeah, nobody really thinks about Florida, but the Democrats have done a very poor job of party building, and I don't think that Jolly has a chance, the Republican registration advantage. But I'm trying to create a scenario where in a Democrat jacked up year, is there any potential way that he could squeak through? And does having someone who could appeal to black voters and young voters, does that potentially help him? I don't see it, but I'm trying to create a conspiracy theory or a theory of the case for Jolly to win.
If I could jump on something you said, actually, just to take it outside of Florida a little bit, but maybe to speak to sort of bigger problems, especially because you inadvertently name dropped my state, but I do think Democrats have sort of a state level institutional problem, just kind of they really, and I get that you need to commit resources where they have a chance, but I feel like in a lot of these states, at least some of the problem is that Democrats get behind a little bit and they just kind of get triaged off the bottom. And, Iowa, I think is the same thing. We were a double Obama state and whatnot. And, we've had super majorities of Republicans in the state legislature recently, and the party's just kind of given up. And I feel like that is kind of a difficulty across. And I think that maybe speaks to, Jolly a little bit, is that, in so many states, there's kind of a Democratic bench problem. They just do not have kind of the lower level office holders to run for statewides and kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy when, statewide offices don't feel like they'll be competitive, then they don't draw good candidates. And so...
Well, you're kind of stuck either way, because that's what Ken Martin tried to do as the new head of the DNC, putting all that money into state and local party building, and even giving a little more to places that they Democrats are chronically uncompetitive, but taking a lot of huge hits for emptying the coffers to do that sort of thing. So, I mean, there's obviously a tension there, right? And I can understand if you're running for something, you don't want to say, well, forget about party building, give me some money for my race that I could actually.
And I mean, you don't want to
win.
set money on fire, I mean, like, building capacity in Wyoming or something like that would just be silly. But
Exactly.
But
I will say on all this, if you take a look at what, and thinking about Nixon and Democratic Socialists, I mean, Democratic Socialists have now won the Democratic nomination for, by my count, 14 House races, as well as that Florida Senate race. And if you take a look at those seats, 13 of those 14 House races are in safe Democratic districts. So they're probably going to get we'll probably see at least 13 Democratic Socialists. The only competitive one is Texas's 34th district, but that still kind of leans Democratic. And so it seems to me this is really good. If you're a DSA person, you really like this because it should allow them to build their numbers in government without actually giving away races to Republicans, right? Because right now there are only the two DSA members in Congress, AOC and Tlaib. And so after the midterms, we're likely to see 15 DSA members in Congress. And just kind of for a sort of a comparison, right now the House Freedom Caucus on the right has around 31 members. And I'm not sure how that's going to change the sort of how the Democratic caucus operates, but a lot's going to depend on the margins. But it's not that difficult to sort of see a DSA caucus forming and having the sort of influence that the Freedom Caucus has had on other issues. I don't know what you guys think about that, but I'm curious.
But I think that's plausible. And I think, one potential advantage that Democrats have had that this might undermine a little bit is that they have had, especially under Speaker Pelosi, have generally had pretty good, party discipline. And, when you look at the Republicans and, John Boehner and the Freedom Caucus, Boehner looked, perpetually depressed. And I think it was largely those guys, because you have, this faction that is, more ideologically extreme. And I think in the case of the Freedom Caucus, as much as anything, it's just, no compromises a lot of the time. And that makes it hard, in a closely divided Congress, to do the kind of building to a majority around a bill where you've got to pick off, a couple people. And so it'll be interesting to see. I don't know so much in terms of policy positions, which I actually don't personally think that the DSA candidates are that far outside of traditional Democratic politics in a lot of ways. But that was quite the eyebrow look, Mike. But
yeah, you can't see I did raise my eyebrows a little bit. We'll talk about that.
I think they have a branding problem as much as anything. I mean, to my mind, they're mostly New Deal Democrats in a lot of ways. But I think the bigger issue would be a question of compromise. So are they willing to? So I think a DSA caucus could be productive for Democrats as a way of kind of generating ideas and bringing what I think is a viewpoint that has a constituency, bringing that some representation. But I think where it's a potential downside is if they behave like some of the Freedom Caucus members where, essentially the litmus test is, do you compromise, do you not? And at this point, I don't think we know enough about how any of them would govern to say one way or the other.
And I don't think we're not gonna know until 2029 if the Democrats take the White House, because in opposition it's easy to just vote against.
Right.
But I do think the Democrats have generally shown, and I don't necessarily agree fully with you, Justin, about outside of the mainstream, because I would probably see some of the policy positions, if the candidates adhere to the Democratic Socialist Manifesto, being a little bit more outside of what traditional Democratic norms have been. But I do believe that if in governing, the Democrats have shown more pragmatism than the Freedom Caucus had done, though I would say in recent years, Trump has enforced a discipline in the House Freedom Caucus when they kind of squawk, but in the end, they typically vote with whatever Trump wants them to vote.
All right, why don't we move on to Alaska, where incumbent Republican Senator Dan Sullivan and Democratic Representative Mary Peltola were the top vote getters in a really competitive race. It's likely to be a very competitive race that could, of course, determine control of the Senate. Now, under Alaska's election rules, the top 4 candidates in the primary, regardless of party, advance to the general election. So joining Peltola and Sullivan will be a second Dan Sullivan. That's Republican Daniel J. Sullivan, who came in a distant third. And Michael, I'll let you kick this off. What do you make of the 2 Dan Sullivans thing in Alaska?
Well, I mean, it may be democracy at its most hilarious, but it's not necessarily democracy at its finest. And as you said, in the top 4 primary, or the top 4 candidates going to the general election, I don't think it's going to matter as much that there's 2 Dan Sullivans in the race because of rank order voting. So if Republicans want to, they can put Dan Sullivan first and Dan Sullivan second. But I do think that there's surprising strength from the Democrats and Peltola, where in the primary, the Democrats all combined got about 50% of the vote in that race, and the Republicans got somewhere around 45, 46, and then there were some nonpartisan folks who ran. So I do think this is a very potential pickup for the Democrats. Peltola is very strong. She's no DSA person, and I see her as potentially a good pickup for the Democrats in the fall.
And also, I'll point out, before I turn to you, Justin, that because Alaska has just that single at-large House seat, essentially the constituency for Peltola when she was a House member was exactly the same, so she knows how to run a statewide race in Alaska, and that's a factor there as well. But go ahead, Justin. What are your thoughts on the?
Darn it,
the
Mike! You
dueling
stole
Dan
my thought.
Sullivans?
Which was
sorry
that
about
she's
that.
already won statewide. I'm actually going to upend the rules here a little bit and go back to Florida for just 1 second,
Go
just
right ahead.
to give a shout out or pour one out for the failed candidacy of Luther Campbell, who lost to Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Not ringing any bells. He's from the 2 Live Crew, which actually probably is what got me into politics on some level, because he went to jail for obscenity for saying bad words at a nightclub back when I was at a formative age. So Uncle Luke has left the building as far as that. So back to Alaska, though. I agree, I think, with kind of where both of you are. This is where I find ranked choice voting, I think, in Alaska is a really interesting thing. And I think it does, with Peltola, she is definitely more moderate, than a lot of Democratic candidates. And I think that, that's what had allowed her to win before, I think, in a lot of ways, is that when you sort of take out that dynamic where you have a primary electorate that is by and large strongly partisan, even more partisan than the average member of the party, I think that gives an opening to a candidate like that, so it's an open primary as opposed to, being only partisans. But your typical primary scenario, you only get sort of get more of the extreme partisans.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a scenario that works there. I agree with you, Mike, 100%, which is that, she's demonstrated that she can win statewide. And I think she's a pretty formidable candidate. I think this is one that kind of contra Florida, which, for years was that swing state. Alaska has been, solidly red for as long as I can remember. And suddenly, and I think some of it is the change in voting system really does sort of put them into slightly swingier positions. Probably not as an electoral vote, but it's only 3, so who cares? But in terms of congressional races and gubernatorial races and things, I think that, electoral structure matters there.
Yeah, and Peltola, when she ran in 2024, she ran and lost by 2.4 points to Begich. But again, that was in a year when Trump was running, pulled out a lot more Republicans. So I think Democrats have to feel pretty good about this race. One more thing I'll mention before we move on is that there's a whole thing from a lot of Republicans saying this Dan Sullivan, this is like a Democratic put-up job and so forth. Now, I will say that it wasn't the Daniel J. Sullivan campaign in a lot of ways wasn't a serious campaign. I mean, he raised under $19,000 and over 10 grand of that was money he loaned his own campaign. I mean, he said he's voted for the Democratic nominee in the last 3 presidential elections. And I get why Republicans wanted to get him off of the ballot. But when you take a look at the money, that's to me, so where's the money coming from? I don't know. I just think it was some weird idiosyncratic thing. I don't buy the conspiracy theory sort of stuff about this just because I don't see any evidence to support that or enough. But then again, that of course just means it's a good conspiracy, right? Where you don't see enough evidence because they're hiding that too.
Can I just make one final point just about turnout in Alaska? Because turnout was about 20%. In Alaska, most people, about 63% of the voters, are either undeclared or nonpartisan. But if you just sort of look at the uphill battle that the Democrats face, the Republicans, there's about 140,000 registered Republicans and only 70,000 registered Democrats. And if we sort of look, and it's not an apples to apples, but in the Democratic candidates in Senate got 63,000 votes and Republicans got 62,000 votes. And so, just it's signaling something about enthusiasm and Democratic Party turnout in 2026. Alaska's not the best example because of the top four, but I think it does show a lot of enthusiasm for Democratic candidates.
All right, well, moving on to foreign policy. Well, it's been another, I guess I'll just say, interesting week. The war with Iran, of course, is still going on. But this week, we've been hearing about issues on the long-deployed aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln. President Trump threatened to bomb the shit out of Oman if it interfered with the naval blockade against Iran. And in a non-Iran related development, he scaled back joint military drills with South Korea, calling the exercises insulting to North Korea, which he characterized as being unthreatening and respectful. He further commented that Kim Jong-un likes him and that I just got along with him very good. All right, so let's start with the Abraham Lincoln story. I mean, is this something that, some folks on the right say this has just been exaggerated by the Trump-hating media, and even if it is a real crisis, is it an isolated thing, or do you think it has any larger implications for, U.S. military readiness at this point in where we're at with Iran? Well, let's start with you, Michael, on this one.
So I want to put it in the context before I answer the military part, because I think about how Trump talks about backing the military, or and Republicans talk about backing the military, backing the blue. And they do it at this abstract level. But I think when it actually comes down to it, the way that Trump and Hegseth talk about the military, there's a real disconnect. They spend so much time obsessing over testosterone, lethality, the warrior culture, beards, physical standards, all this chest thumping about building the most dominant fighting force imaginable, that they sometimes forget that what the fighting force actually is young men and young women. And they seem to, in the statements that they're making, whether it's exaggerated a lot or exaggerated a little, I don't think it's wholly out of thin air that this is coming up, that there are real problems on the USS Abraham Lincoln. And it's really kind of showing to me, and from my perspective, that they don't care about the people. And that's what makes this sickening, is that instead of saying, hey, yeah, there's some problems there, and we acknowledge them because of the bombing of the base and having to be at sea for so long, and the supply lines are so long from Diego Garcia, that they just kind of just paper over and say, no problem here at all. And so I just think it's really just part of Trump's lack of care about people.
Well, before we get to you, Justin, I will say on August 14th, when he was asked if the Lincoln's deployment had gone on too long, President Trump, in fact, said, no, not nearly long enough. It's well, okay, that's an interesting thing to double down on, but there you go. Justin, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree very much with Michael on this, and maybe in a slightly different direction. I think the care is very much it, but there has been this just profound shift, whether it's policing or military or whatever. And I like that you highlight the testosterone, element of this. And the one I always go back to is getting, MMA fighters to train the FBI. It is all sort of symptomatic of the same thing, which is this very sort of performative, manly, tough guy BS, largely. And I think you're right that a lot of this is not caring. And I'm going to come back to that in a second with some of the response to this that I've seen. But I think another is just a profound misunderstanding of how a lot of things work. When you get people that installed in office that just do not fundamentally understand how these institutions function. And, that's not to say that institutions can't change. But, and this is going to come up when we do our rants and raves later, actually, but, the history of military success is really one of supply chains, and that is a whole lot less exciting than some story of some, heroic guy that, kills 12 Viet Cong after getting his leg shot off or whatever. Those are the stories that make news. But gosh, so much of this is procurement and, can we feed troops at the front lines, which was, a huge thing for millennia. And, can we source, hardware that is both effective and cost effective and things like that. And, I think we see this again and again with Trump, meddling with, the design of ships and things like that. You just have people with no conception of how any of how any of this works. I think, Michael, to your point, where I've seen some of the kind of contempt, for people in uniform at this point, I am way too online, and I've seen a lot of, kind of conservative pushback about the Abraham Lincoln, in particular, in a way that feels very coordinated by somebody. And it's very much the same talking points. But so much of it is, these sailors are soft. It's all from people that claim to be ex-Navy, and I have a suspicion that they're not. But, it is very much kind of punching down. It is very much, insulting to the people who are in uniform. And, I can't speak to the veracity of the claims, here in terms of, whether they are exaggerated or accurate or what have you. But I think the fact of the matter is it's not a great situation. And the response to that, rather than to sort of do something about it, as it would seem, is just to insult people for not being tough enough.
Yeah. To go back to something you said, Michael, earlier, just to kind of fill in, very early at the very beginning of the war, Iran attacked the Fifth Fleet's headquarters in Bahrain, and that forced the Navy to reroute supply from very close to where the Lincoln was all the way to Diego Garcia, which is like 2,200 miles away. And so you have the Lincoln deploying for around 9 months, which is about 2 months longer than typical, or at least what the Navy shoots for. And they've only had a single brief port call for R in Guam. And this was way at the beginning of the deployment, whereas carrier deployments typically include multiple port calls for not just for R&R, but for maintenance and for resupply and things like that. And so that gets into stuff both you guys were saying. And I'll just say kind of as a personal, perspective, I didn't go through anything remotely like what the Lincoln's crew seems to have gone through when I was deployed for months on end for a million years ago in Operation Desert Storm. But I know that myself and my fellow Marines, we got worn down over time, and that was with a good supply situation and a decent number of R&R breaks. So I can only imagine what some of those sailors are going through. And clearly, not only, I don't know if Trump and Hegseth don't understand this, maybe, but I think this goes back to Trump believing that this would be a short operation, a few months at most, right? And so he clearly wasn't prepared, or the military didn't prepare, didn't have time to prepare for a more extended engagement. So I'd say the Lincoln issue to me doesn't seem to be a military leadership problem as much as sort of a top-level war planning and logistics miscalculation problem. As you pointed out, Justin, that might not be the glamorous stuff, but without that stuff in place, you end up with a lot of dead bodies and not a lot of gains.
And I think
that's exactly the.
Oh, sorry. I think, a couple of things. I mean, this goes to depleting our missile stockpile, as well. And I think that speaks to both kind of a lack of strategy and also, like you said, it's longer. I will also say, and this, just to be clear, is not an endorsement of the Iranian military, but the butt's going to be good, but clearly they are leveraging, fairly limited resources in pretty smart ways. I think one thing that's been sort of, I think, a surprise to lots of people, including me, is how long they have been able to keep this up, as you point out. And, we've destroyed a lot of their hardware and things like that, but they seem to kind of know the region better, it feels like. and they know what the choke points are. Taking out kind of a supply base early on is a good tactical move. That is and controlling the Strait of Hormuz. They know what their resources are, and it seems like they are able to kind of leverage, smaller power, in terms of men and hardware, but deploy it in ways that are pretty effective.
So
go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to say to the point where I'm agreeing with both of you. I mean, Trump treats this like a TV show. And he takes what happened in Venezuela, like it was easy. And he, there was a comment he made about everything always works out. And he just assumes, and I am not a military tactician or a military expert, but from everything that I'm reading, it was military 101 that if a war started with Iran, that Iran would target the base, the Navy infrastructure in Bahrain. And on day one, they took it out of commission. And this just shows, as you said, they were maybe planning for days or weeks, is that the senior officials in the Trump administration, I'm not blaming the military leaders because I'm sure that they gave them this advice, they didn't plan well enough to know, okay, if this happens, what are we going to do next? And that is a dereliction of duty by Hegseth and Trump.
Yeah, one weird thing to me in all of this is that two seemingly contradictory things seem to be, not necessarily contradictory things, are true at the same time. Number one, the U.S. military is by far the most powerful in the world, not even close, right? I mean, there are 23 total aircraft carriers in the world. The U.S. has 11 of them. China is next at 3, okay? But yet, if you take a look at those 11 carriers, only I think only 3 are actively deployed, right? You have the Lincoln, which is just ending its deployment, the Washington, which left the Western Pacific to relieve the Lincoln, and the George H.W. Bush, which is somewhere in the Arabian Sea. But the rest of them are in port, getting overhauled, something like that. And so even though we are so massively powerful, it does not look like we have the ability to handle 2 significant military actions at the same time, because we had to pull that carrier out of the Pacific, from the area of China, presumably still our main geopolitical rival. So, we may have a huge military, but if we want to do the kind of stuff that President Trump seems to want to do, it's clearly not big enough.
If you notice, we're not talking about Cuba anymore.
That's next week, right?
But that felt like an invasion is imminent kind of thing, a couple weeks ago, right. and that seems to be off the table. Yeah, I'm agreeing with you here. Is that I don't think we have the resources to fight all of the things that Trump wants to fight, especially when you're fighting them in ways that don't really respect the resources.
Mike, can I ask you a question? So you made the point, and I had that in my notes, so good that we were thinking on the number of aircraft carriers and the number deployed. But the USS George Washington is permanently forward deployed in and around China. And now that being redeployed to the Middle East, and the USS Abraham Lincoln, what do you think this could mean? And maybe there's no danger here of moving it from Asia into the Middle East for what could transpire over the next 6 or 9 months in that theater.
I think for a lot of folks, of course, the big concern is what China might do in regards to Taiwan, but my sense of things is that they're not quite at that point yet. And so I assume it's a reasonably safe thing, but who knows? I think it's a reasonable concern. A lot of folks saying, where are our real adversaries? And China, right? And so if we don't have one of our 11 carriers or one of our 3 active carriers there, how can that not be at least somewhat of a concern? That said, we bash Trump a lot about this. Right now, I read him as being frustrated and acting out. That's what I hear about the Oman thing, right? It seems like he's given up on more serious military strikes in Iran, especially given what we know about the lack of interceptors or shortage of them. But he might also, if I take him sort of at his word, maybe he's legitimately playing a longish game, and he's willing to burn political capital, willing to lose more seats in Congress than he might otherwise lose to kind of bring Iran to heel. And You know, I mean,
Trump playing the long game might be the
I
most
know,
laughable comment
I'm just,
you've ever made.
I'm
And
presenting the steel man case
I
here.
wasn't going to go that
I'm
far,
just
but
sort
I
of
disagree. You know, yeah.
Well, let me just say, I mean, I think we can't forget that in addition to what Iran is doing to its own people and has been for a long time, and its clear desire to get a nuclear weapon, Iran is also the world's leading sponsor of state sponsor of terrorism. Right. And so, and it's way bigger in terms of a sponsor of state terrorism than the other three countries we see as state sponsors, which are North Korea, Cuba, and Syria. I mean, Iran's economy, at least before January or February 28th, was bigger than all of those three countries combined. So again, I'm not saying that I believe this, but I'm saying that it is possible that if Trump stays the course, something good geopolitically could actually come out of this. I don't see that as being the likely outcome, but I'm trying to understand it from that kind of MAGA type perspective.
Mike, I want to grant you Iran and the horrific nature of the regime. But to say that Trump has any long game for anything, like this is a guy who he's not getting out of the White House very often. When he does, he's still talking about the helipad. He's talking about, the ballroom. Like this is not a guy who's fixated on solving the problem in the Middle East. In between naps, I'm sure that he thinks about it every so often when Natalie brings him something in the printout about it. But like, this is not a guy that I think is serious about anything right now.
You and John Ossoff going at the guy.
But he's just not, if you look at the number of, the amount of traveling that he's doing is pretty low right now. The amount of times he's getting out of the White House is pretty low. He's talking about the politics in front of these lifeguards that he has at the White House. I mean, this is not a guy who is really focused on anything other than, and yeah, I do sound like John Ossoff. Is like, what deals can he do on crypto to get in billions of dollars? And his ballroom and his helipad. I mean, that's the only thing that he seems
Allow me to
interested in.
reformulate. Fair enough. Allow me to reformulate. I believe at this point, President Trump may have been forced into playing a long game he is not temperamentally suited for because it is his last best option. How about that?
Okay, I'll grant you.
I never thought that I would be, pining for the days of John Bolton, but it's we kind of I actually, Mike, on some level
I am still not pining for the days of John Bolton. I want to be. That's not an endorsement either, is it?
No, apart from the mustache, but I do, I agree with your premise. The first part of your premise, which is that Iran is a legitimate problem, and for all of the reasons that you cite, and I. Kind of to other Mike's point, I am not a military strategist either, so I don't have, a grand, way to fix this. But I do, and this is something that, Americans have been dealing with for decades and wanting to do something, but not, necessarily doing much of anything. But I agree, wholeheartedly that I don't think Trump has any sort of long game. I mean, if anything defines him, it's that he's tremendously impulsive. So, John Bolton, not great, but, gosh, there were at least, even if they were saber rattlers, at least semi-serious strategic thinking people in high places, previously. And there just doesn't seem to be anybody around Trump that it's not just Trump at this point. It's that everybody around him seems to have basically the same sorts of issues with executing this operation.
Well, guys, I should just say in closing that while neither of you are military strategists, I was, of course, a sergeant in the Marines close to 30 years ago, and I've watched Apocalypse Now over 20 times, so I think you guys should just defer to me on all this stuff, basically. Anyway, why don't we move on? So in a recent ABC News interview, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the most prominent progressives in the country, quoted a New York City councilman saying, "Woke one was crazy." Now, she said that candidates should be judged on their current positions, not what they've said in the past, and that while COVID provided a window for what she called fruitful discussions, the rhetoric of that time is, in her words, not rhetoric that we would use today. Now, to a lot of conservatives, I think that sounded like a far too convenient repudiation of views that, well, they think are increasingly toxic with voters. Now, some progressives, I think, heard it as AOC maybe trying to distance herself from a movement that seems to finally be gaining ground, at least in Democratic primary elections. And I think about the only people who weren't at least somewhat upset were centrist Democrats who I think appreciate AOC's celebrity, but disagree with a lot of her, at least previous, apparently, policy positions. So, Justin, we'll start with you. What's your read of AOC's comments on this?
I think a lot of this is probably electoral. I mean, we have had sort of a cultural shift, in some ways. And I'm struck by sort of how much, with Trump pushing back in the other direction, how much more coarse a lot of political discussion has become. Again, I spend too much time online, and the mistake that I always make is reading the comment section. But the amount of just virulent racism in comments, the amount of, the resurgence of the R slur, et cetera, is just, what we do. I think, the pendulum has swung, and I think there is a sense of, it is probably not a tenable position to be too woke, on some level. I mean, not that the people that are, engaged in the nastiest side of the comment section they're not persuadable, just to be clear. But certainly there's a narrative out there that, woke went too far and woke this and woke that. Honest to God, I don't know what exactly the basket of stuff is. In kind of last week I read, the Bret Stephens New York Times column about this, and, there should be reparations for woke 1.0. And frankly, after reading his thing, it's just a bundle of unrelated grievances, for the most part. And I think it's this amorphous target on some level that, there's one of my favorite memes. It's like a golden book, that the title is "Everything I Don't Like Is Woke." And to me, I mean, that's a lot of that. I mean, it's like nailing Jello to a wall or something, trying to figure out what this is. So I'm not exactly sure, what we're repudiating here. But I do think, we see, you mentioned policy. I think more of it, frankly, is sort of this cultural stuff. If you look at the Stevens thing, very little of it is policy. I mean, he's basically policing people's language. He's mad that AOC once said menstruating people, instead of women and things like that. To be fair, I mean, he's got a couple things in there that, are I think problematic in terms of people getting fired and things like that. But they seem to be fairly episodic, but so much of this is just, I feel like it's a proxy for bigger cultural things more than it's policy in a lot of ways. And a lot of it, frankly, is sort of outside of government. I mean, there is a lot of sort of the examples that get cited of woke excess. It's more like, people were mean to me on Blue Sky, rather than like a coherent bundle of policies. So I'm not sure what to do with this, in all honesty. I guess just to simplify my ramble, I'm not sure what woke 1 is and how that differs from woke 2 or the forthcoming woke 2.1. I'm not sure what the solution is, or frankly, what it has to do with government, in a lot of ways. I mean, I think it is, as much as anything, sort of a cultural back and forth. I do think, I mean, it poses some potential pitfalls, to loop in somebody, not here. And to get back to a little bit of our DSA conversation, I mean, you do get people on the left that say some pretty boneheaded things, from time to time. The Fong in Wisconsin, the line about Thanksgiving, it comes to mind. And, there are some people that believe some pretty crazy stuff out there. On the other hand, I don't know that the things that get cited are very like atypical, I feel like, and so I'm going to stop.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this as you were talking, and I'll just say one snarky thing first around, Republicans holding Democrats to every wild, outlandish thing that some activist said online or some slogan that only a very small percentage, that I can't wait to hear how when the Democrats come back into the White House in 2029, the Republicans are going to somehow get religion again on the national debt and reducing the $40 trillion in debt that we're in. But I think AOC is basically right about the substance. And although I hate, that we're talking about this and doing it in software releases for progressive politics of 1.0 and 2.0 and 2.1 and all of that kind of stuff. But defund the police was an atrocious slogan for Democrats, even if it was still a small sliver of the Democratic activist base that actually was talking about it. Because, when we look at the National Guard, and I was sad that you weren't there to discuss it last week with us, Michael, and Trey and I talked about the National Guard deployment. Because if you ask, talk about defund the police, and then you ask real people in neighborhoods that are afflicted by crime, like, even though they might not want armed police who are responding to every mental health crisis or every homeless situation, and rather have different kinds of professionals dealing with that there were crime problems that were real and substantive that the police were necessary for. And Black communities were not necessarily wanting to defund the police, but wanted a different way of policing. And I think that all got mixed up with it. But the right wants to turn all of these slogans and these cultural issues, whether it's trans rights or defund the police or abolish ICE, into proof that an underlying problem never existed. And to me, that's nonsense. And so, the progressive lesson as we move from, woke 1.0 to 2.0 isn't that we should stop caring about racial or gender justice. It should be, less performative politics, more material politics, housing, healthcare, childcare, wages, civil rights, competent policing, rather than just sloganeering.
I think one of the things, Michael, that brings up for me, and kind of back to something I said about the DSA, earlier, they have sort of a strong messaging and branding problem in a lot of ways. And some of it's institutional. I was just reading something, the other day. I forget what the statement was, but, it came from some DSA caucus, because there's all these DSA caucuses. And it turns out that this DSA caucus was one guy, essentially. And, they have this problem of platforming these things that don't have appeal. I think you're absolutely right. And some of it, is, I think, some of it's policy, I think, potentially, but some of it is branding. I think a lot of the stuff that was actually, if you get under the hood of defund the police, a lot of it was stuff that I think people could be sold on, because it wasn't just, we're going to shut down every police station. And, it was more about, hey, let's reallocate resources into community things and things like that. And so I agree. I think a lot of this is performative. Some of it is, there are people who, as you rightly point out, there are people that believe this stuff and then get platformed. And there is this tendency, I think, both from Republicans and probably the press, to kind of saddle people with the baggage of kind of what the craziest people, in the party might believe. So, I think that's, a real challenge here. And I think where Republicans for a long time, just in general, have done better on sort of the sloganeering and the branding, because I think even a lot of these things that get labeled as, woke policy, if you take away the name, I think it's something that, has a broader appeal. Maybe not a winning appeal always, but it's anyway. Mike, you're making faces.
I disagree pretty strongly with both of you guys. I think you're going way out of your way to be as kind as possible to the DSA, and I don't buy it. I feel like, Michael, whether consciously or not, you sort of shifted it from, it's one thing to say, okay, here are what some crazy folks, some random folks on the internet who call themselves DSA members say, and that means all DSA is like that. And that is not okay to do. I agree 100% with you with that. But I read her comments as being different, because she took those I mentioned from a New York City council person, AOC, who used a line in earlier this year to basically wave off a comment he made in 2021 when he said that a cis white man shouldn't be the next speaker of the council in New York City. So basically, I read that as being in context and how she meant it. It's like, oh yeah, I said some things back then. They were just crazy. It was a time, right? And to me, that sounds way too much like, take Trump seriously, not literally. I'm going to apply the same stand. If I'm going to call out Trump for saying, well, he's not, of course, going to bomb the shit out of them. He just means, well, they shouldn't do that. And so no, I think this is just, it's not just a branding issue. Yeah, I agree with you, Justin. It's a branding issue. It's a marketing issue. But that's like the Cleveland Browns saying, you know what the problem is? The problem isn't that we have Deshaun Watson and Shadur Sanders fighting to be our QB1. My God, I wouldn't put them on my high school school team. No, the problem is that it's our helmets are just too dull. That orange is just not working anymore. Let's find a better color. No, they've got a crappy product too. So that I would argue DSA has bad marketing, bad messaging, and honestly, in a lot of ways, just a bad product.
So, Mike, I don't want to do a whataboutism here, but I'm going to do a whataboutism.
No, go ahead. Please do.
Is, when we sort of like think about that comment that you just made about a cis white gender man in the New York City Council or whatever the comment was, it made me think about Pete Hegseth and talking about, whether we have woke 1.0 and unwoke 1.0 or whatever it is, about how all decisions are going to be based upon merit. And then what does he do, whether it's in firing Lisa Franchetti or with Wilson and others in the military, when there's a targeted attack to go after women and minorities in the military, not on the basis of merit, but on the basis of anti-wokeism that's masquerading as, in my view, as racism and gender discrimination. And so I sort of like wonder, you'll hold some of these folks, lower level folks, to this accountability. And I agree with you and even Biden, when he's saying, I'm going to appoint the first Black woman Supreme Court justice, right? Like in making that pledge, or saying that he's going to appoint a woman to being VP. But I think that that's different from like woke politics. It's a recognition that historically that people who are meritorious were and are overlooked because of the color of their skin or their gender. And I actually worry about this when I sort of like look at some politicians, because I think about the boogeyman of trans folks now, and I look at Sarah McBride and I hear her speak and I follow what she's saying, and I say, boy, if she weren't trans, she could really rise in politics in the United States. And that's a sad statement. That's not woke 1.0. That is the backlash to any DEI and any trans related issues in the U.S.
And I agree entirely with you that, I mean, I feel like I can hold both positions that that woke 1.0 or whatever you want to call it went too far, was too extreme. And also that the counter reaction, the anti-woke thing, went too far because, of course, that's how you get heard at all. And we have these sort of, I'll call them entrepreneurs out there, attention entrepreneurs out there, like AOC and others. And I mean, I guess I don't know her. I assume she's at least somewhat sincere, but she's a really good attention entrepreneur, as are a lot of these folks on the right. And so they say, I understand why they say what they say, but I am going to hold them to what they say, whether they're coming from the woke left or the anti-woke right. And I guess I'll say one other thing on this before we kind of close out. It seems to me that there might actually be a distinction worth making here. Because when I was thinking about woke 1.0 and so forth, I mean, it seems to me that the distinction, if you want to make one, is that kind of around, you see woke 1.0 around 2016, right, with Trump and Me Too, the campus speech stuff and all that, kind of peaks around 2020, 2021 with the George Floyd thing and so forth. Then we have that weird in-between period with Biden, and then woke 2.0 kind of starting after the 2024 election, because I think I really see, when I'm thinking about the distinctions, the question I ask myself is, well, is the Progressive Coalition changing some of its beliefs, changing just its language, or changing the issues it foregrounds? Honestly, I think it's kind of all three of those, but the biggest thing it's trying to change is, I think, the language. Well, the issues, like Michael, I think you're the one who said, kind of pushing some of the cultural stuff back a little bit further. Not that Republicans are going to let them get away with that, I don't think. But I don't really know that they're changing policy positions exactly yet. Of course, it's not like DSA is a monolith any more than the Freedom Caucus or the Republican or Democratic parties are either.
Yeah, I mean, I just going back to the whole conversation about woke, I just wish we could retire the term because at some level, these labels just become meaningless, right? Like, let's actually get to the substance rather than just labeling people woke, because I don't know, I don't want to be asleep. I want to be awake, and I want to be cognizant of the challenges that we face on, and I think, when we sort of like look at woke, I mean, woke arose during COVID, right? Like, and it was a period of people were terminally online and always online. I think that there was people were trying to find community and meaning. There was a lot of rage that was building, and there is a lot of rage that is present for a lot of people. And I think especially among younger constituents, because they can't afford homes, they can't afford healthcare, they went to college, jobs are not plentiful. They see AI is taking away a lot of entry-level jobs, especially. And I think that there's just a lot of rage. And whether that's woke 1.0, if it's idiocracy, I don't know what it is, but it's a real issue that politicians have to come to grips with.
Absolutely. All right. Well, on that note, we will close. We have plenty more we want to talk about, and we will get to that in the midweek show. I'm looking forward to that. But for now, hey, if anything we discussed today made an impression, whether you loved it, hated it, or just like, what? Just let us know. We'd love to hear from you. You can do that through email, mail@politicsguys.com, or you can reach out through Facebook, X, or our supporters Discord. As always, all of the links are in the show notes, and I am on Discord all the time. And hey, if you're getting value from this show and you can support what we do, we would really appreciate that. The best way to do that is through Patreon. You can even start with a free trial, and all supporters get ad-free episodes, the full midweek show instead of just a preview, and access to that Discord with even more benefits at higher levels of support. And if Patreon's not your thing, no problem. We also have PayPal and Venmo with all those links in the show notes as well. And if you'd like those full midweek episodes, but you cannot support us financially right now, totally not a problem. Just send me an email. I'm Mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get that set up for you. And whether you support us or not, it is a big help if you subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you listen, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, as always, a very special thanks to our fantastic executive producers. They are Will Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Brian Motsid, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugate. We'll be back with a new episode next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.